We call this Setting Priorities in Higher Education, and we will be hearing from national experts on this issue. But I hope you will also take a look at the agenda as a bit of a roadmap about ACTA's strategic plan and the way we focus on the challenges facing higher education today. As you all well know, historical literacy has been a key feature of our work from the very beginning, and so we're quite pleased to continue in the tradition of some historical training from none other than Pulitzer Prize winning Gordon Wood today. So we'll get off the meeting with a wonderful start. As you also know, we're deeply concerned that students across the country are graduating without the skills and knowledge they need to succeed. And so one of the things we'll be focusing on today is a major initiative of ACTA's, What Will They Learn? Returning the core curriculum to our colleges and universities so that students are ensured exposure to the key areas of knowledge that they will need to succeed in a very dynamic, very competitive marketplace. And we will be joined by employers and donors who are as concerned as we are about the deficiencies we're seeing in college graduate education. We'll also be looking at the dollars that go into higher education. As you all know, as taxpayers, you are paying dearly for colleges and universities, and you want value to come out of it. There are too many signs that the dollars that we are investing are not returning properly for students or for the public. And so we will be looking at costs and ways to be more accountable. We'll be looking at graduation rates, retention rates, and other challenges in this area. When we come back after lunch, we will have a colloquy between the senior higher ed reporter, Daniel Devise, whose pieces are in your packet. I urge you to take a look at them, with the former president from Harvard, Larry Summers. All I can say is there's no telling what we'll hear. Rethinking Old Models, our last session, will be focusing on the great work that governors can do working with strong policymakers in the state. One of the most recent booklets that ACTA has published is something for governors, reaching out our hand to them to help them empower the trustees that they typically appoint on behalf of quality and accountability in the states. And so we'll be hearing some wonderful experts about great things happening at the state level as well. And for closing remarks, we simply put a typo in the agenda just to test your skills and to make certain that you're keeping an eye on our work. So with that summary, I just want to say welcome to our two first speakers, and most particularly to Dr. Bob Blewett, the board chairman, who will be introducing our keynote this morning.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. As chairman of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, it's truly a pleasure to see all of you here today. Over the years, I've seen how this conference has grown, and I'm particularly impressed by the quality of the audience as well as the quality of the speakers. I know all of you care very deeply about higher education and American history, and today we will have the opportunity to engage some of the leading thinkers and scholars in the fields of history, business, philanthropy, and of course, higher education. We'll also have a chance to share ideas with each other and the ACTA staff as we work together to advance academic excellence. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Gordon Wood. Dr. Wood has a notable list of accomplishments. He is the Alva O. Way University Professor and Professor of History Emeritus at Brown University. He received his undergraduate education from Tufts and his PhD from Harvard. He taught at Harvard and the University of Maryland before joining the faculty at Brown in 1969. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. As an historian, Dr. Wood writes with academic authority for popular audiences. That's largely us. His book, The Radicalism of the American Revolution, won the 1993 Pulitzer Prize for History. And his recent work, The Empire of Liberty, A History of the Early Republic, which I believe is back in the back of the room, which people can see, won the American Publishers Association Prize for History and Biography and the American History Book Prize from the New York Historical Society. For many years, he has written reviews for the New York Review of Books and the New Republic, some of which are published in the 2008 book, The Purpose of the Past. This year marks the 150th anniversary of the American Civil War, 1861 to 2011, a war which we could spend almost as many years studying before getting any answers to some of its basic questions. Dr. Wood will share with us today his original historical perspective, the revolutionary origins of the American Civil War. This is an important topic which I'm sure we will more fully understand with his talk. So please join me in welcoming to the podium Dr. Gordon Wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. It's really a great pleasure to be here. As Bob said, the 2011 is the sesquicentennial of the beginning of the Civil War, and we've had many, and will have through the rest of this year, I think, commemorations of that event. But as important as the Civil War is in our national memory, it should never replace our memory of the American Revolution, which, in my mind at least, remains the single most important event in our history. Indeed, the success of Abraham Lincoln in preserving the Union was, I think, due to his understanding of what the American Revolution meant to his fellow Americans. Now, when Lincoln was elected president in 1860 on a platform of preventing the extension of slavery into the West, the Southern states felt their way of life was threatened, and they seceded, as you know, from the Union. Since many states, including those of New England, had talked of seceding from the Union at various times in the antebellum period following the Revolution, explaining the secession of the Southern states, it seems to me, is not a major historical problem. I think we can fairly easily account for why the Southern states seceded. What is more difficult to explain is why the Northern states cared. Why was the North willing to go to war to preserve the Union? Now, it was not because the North was bent on the abolition of slavery, at least not at first. Many Northerners, of course, were opposed to slavery, but what they were especially opposed to was the extension of slavery into the West. Northerners were opposed to the extension of slavery into the Western areas because they knew that slavery would create a society incompatible with the one they wanted for their children and their grandchildren, who they presumed would settle in the West. But this was not the only reason why the North cared enough for the Union to engage in a long and bloody civil war that cost Northerners several 100,000 lives. To fully understand why the North cared enough to resist the secession of the Southern states, we have to go back to the Revolution and the ideas and the ideals that came out of it. Lincoln's words, which I think have aptly been called his sword, were crucial, I think crucial, in sustaining the struggle to maintain the Union. With his words, he reached back to the Revolution to draw inspiration and understanding of what the Civil War meant for the nation and the world. He knew what the Revolution was about and what it implied, not just for Americans, but for all mankind. The United States was a new republican nation in a world of monarchies, a grand experiment in self-government, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The American people of 1860, said Lincoln, deeply felt the moral principles of equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence, and this moral principle made them one with the founders. In Lincoln's words, as though they were blood of the blood and flesh of the men who wrote the Declaration. This emphasis on liberty and equality, he said, was the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men anywhere in the world. Now, with words like these, drawing on the meaning of the American Revolution, Lincoln expressed what many Americans felt about themselves and the future of all mankind. Liberty and equality, he said, were promised not just to the people of this country, but to the world for all future time. The Revolution, he said, gave promise that in due time the weight should be lifted from the shoulders of all men, and that all should have an equal chance in the race of life. But if the American experiment in self-government failed, then this hope for the future would be lost. Now, spreading freedom and democracy throughout the world had been an explicit goal of the Revolution. It was what turned our little colonial rebellion into a world historical event, important for everyone throughout the world. Americans believed that the French Revolution in 1789 was a direct consequence of their revolution. And many of the French leaders, Lafayette in particular, thought so too, which is why he sent the key to the Bastille to Washington, where today it hangs in Mount Vernon. But all the 19th century efforts in creating democracy in Europe had ended in failure. Americans had seen the French Revolution spiral into tyranny. All the attempts by Europeans to create democracies in the revolutions of 1848 had been crushed. By the 1860s, as Lincoln pointed out, the United States was a lone beacon of democratic freedom in a world of monarchies. On American shoulders alone rested the survival of and the possibility of self-government. It was indeed the last best hope for the future of democracy. That responsibility was what sustained Lincoln throughout the war. A war, as he said in his Gettysburg Address, that was testing whether this nation, dedicated to liberty, equality, and self-government, could long endure. In commemorating the Civil War, we commemorate the Revolution. And indeed, in an important sense, the Northern success in the Civil War was the culmination of the Revolution. Now, how did this nation that had once been united enough to defeat the greatest power in the world fall apart and engage in a long and bloody civil war? The seeds of the Civil War were probably sown when the first slaves were brought to Virginia in the 17th century. But no one, of course, sensed that at the time. Even in 1776, when Americans declared their independence from Great Britain, no one foresaw a civil war in the newly created United States. To be sure, the 13 separate North American colonies were not very united. That they were able to come together at all in 1776 was something of a miracle. Before the Revolution, the British colonies had little sense of connectedness. Most of them had closer ties with London and Britain than they had with one another. Until the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia in 1774, more of its members had been to London than had been to Philadelphia. It was Great Britain and the policies that created the colonists' sense of being Americans. In fact, the British officials were the ones who defined the colonists as Americans. Until the last moment before independence, the colonists thought of themselves as Englishmen. It was British tyranny expressed in the Coercive Acts of 1774 that made colonists like Patrick Henry declare that they were not Virginians or New Yorkers, but Americans. The long and bloody war with Great Britain, in which all parts of the country suffered at one time or another, was a searing experience. More Americans died in that war in proportion to population than in any other war in our history. 1% of the population would be 3 million losses today. Of course, with the exception of the Civil War, in which case both sides were Americans. No wonder that the Revolution bred an overwhelming sense of unity with those kinds of losses. The glorious cause of the Revolution united all Americans. The Revolution and the beliefs and ideals that came out of it, liberty, equality, self-government, created national bonds that were not easily broken. Indeed, they are the bonds that still hold us together, I think, and make us think of ourselves as a single people. Of course, Americans at the time of the Revolution were aware of sectional differences that were essentially, I think, based on slavery. Although slavery in 1776 legally existed in all the Republican states, 90% of the nearly 500,000